Can you imagine living in the world without the internet? I know, right? Feels like the web's been around forever. But once upon a time there was no Google, no YouTube, no social media. There wasn't even an always-on connection. Back then, if you wanted to send a digital message, you had to use a dial-up modem that made all sorts of screeching noises over your phone line. And if someone in the house picked up the phone during that connection, it would cut you off instantly. Surprisingly, those finicky phone lines didn't stop people from creating a massive worldwide network. One of the largest and most revolutionary examples was Fidonet, often called Fido. Believe it or not, at its peak it had around 4 million users worldwide, and it operated with zero government oversight. There were no giant data centers, no massive server farms, and the cloud was just something you saw in the sky. Fido was essentially a giant network of home computers talking to each other through phone modems. So how did Fidonet actually work? Why it was so different from the modern internet? And why did it fade away? To see Fidonet in action, we need to go back about 40 years. Back then, streaming meant your favorite radio station, and your phone was this typical landline in the house, if you even had one. Sometimes people had to run over to neighbors just to make a call. The internet existed only in research labs and universities, definitely not in your living room. To install a program, a game, or even share a video clip, you needed floppy disks. And those floppies were literally floppy. But here's a funny thing. That same home phone you used to call grandma could transmit data too, thanks to a dial-up modem. It turned digital data into bytes, then into audio signals, and sent them over the telephone line. And the reverse process occurred at the other side of the wire to receive. Speeds were microscopic by today's standards, like 30 kilobytes per second. Such communication was not permanent, but switched. This is what dial-up means. That is, it consisted of sessions. Imagine, it means that to watch a video on YouTube you would have to make a call somewhere. For a session you had to make a phone call to another computer. And my call, so a peer-to-peer connection isn't a network, is it? Or not? Quite a network, said the American programmer Tom Jennings, who invented Fidonet in 1984. Fido, by the way, is the name of his dog. That dog with a floppy disk became the network's logo. That's what it looked like. Originally, Tom just wanted an easy way to swap messages with coworkers. But it turned out the architecture of his software allows the network to grow and grow and grow. By the mid-90s it had over 35,000 nodes, like little local hubs, and spanned continents. But let's not skip the best part. Tom didn't set out to create a worldwide phenomenon. He was just doing his own thing. However, since phone calls within a city were often free or cheaper, more folks started dialing into each other's computers. Then people in different regions wanted in, so they rigged up some fancy long-distance tricks. Before you knew it, tens of thousands of users were exchanging messages and files across the globe, all without centralized servers. But before we look at how it all happened, let's look at how the modern internet is organized. Fundamentally, the whole internet is a connection between a client and a server. The server has data, and the client wants it. However, as the web has evolved and become more common, we have many ways to connect, from wires to radio waves. The servers themselves have gotten bigger, cooler, turned into entire clusters of supercomputers that are interconnected and distribute data, and load to optimize access speeds. And the entire planet is covered with a huge network of wires, including underwater. 10 billion devices send and receive terabytes of information every second. Just 40 years ago, of course, there was no such thing, but there was telephony. And Fidonet architecture is different from the most basic level. Originally, the Fidonet was built around direct point-to-point connections for mail and file transfer. That is, the modem simply dialed the phone number it needed, and the connection was established directly between the two participants. Moreover, intracity phone calls were usually free of charge. It is not surprising that more and more people become members of the network. The geography grew, and it became clear that direct, long-distance and international transmission of information, due to its cost, cannot be limited directly, and a hierarchical tree structure was chosen. Don't worry, the actual network layout looked something like this. At the lowest level were subscribers of the network, or points. Subscribers located in one city or neighborhood were united by a station, or node, also a member of the network but with its own obligations. Accordingly, the node received and redirected mail from other subscribers of the network and between other nodes. And all this did not happen automatically. The node was managed by a system operator. It turns out that if one person wanted to send a message to another, it must be done through the node. Therefore, one of the main duties of each node was 1 hour a day to receive incoming calls from the modems of opponents and transmit messages to others. With the further growth of the number of nodes, which by the mid-90s was more than 35,000, it was decided to unite several nodes into a network. Networks were united into regions, and those become zones. Quite a serious hierarchy. But how such a large number of messages did not get confused? As in the internet, Fidonet has its own addressing to find the right subscriber, but it's organized a little differently. In the internet, each device or server has its own IP address. For example, Instagram has it like this. IP address is just 4 numbers, each with a value from 0 to 255. But the addresses in the Fidonet looked different. Their format was like this. First came the numbers of the zone. There were 6 of them. Then a colon, followed by the network number. Then a slash and the number of the node and the point number, which is a specific subscriber. All these numbers were simply sequential and were assigned as the network grew in size. But let me remind you, unlike the modern internet, there were no non-stop servers. So how did all this huge infrastructure work? To control this large network, in Fidonet there was a system of coordinators. There were network coordinators who controlled regions and zones, so it was also strictly hierarchical. What did they do? In fact, they accepted new structural units into the network, nodes of other networks, and sometimes solved low-level problems. In general, something like the internet, but with bureaucracy and a human factor. Speaking of control, Fidonet had a set of rules that was mandatory for all participants of the network, and the total ban was only 1. Mailing of advertising and other commercial information were prohibited. Fidonet enforced a strict set of rules for all participants, with only one prohibition: no advertising or commercial content. Violation of this rule could lead to immediate and permanent ban from the entire network. On the one hand, it's kind of cool. On the other hand, it may have killed the technology. And importantly, after the first violation of this rule, the guilty party was exposed to excommunication, meaning he was permanently banned from the network. The modern internet, as you know, is basically open to everyone, which is already a major difference from Fidonet. But that wasn't the only difference. In fact, there are 2 fundamental distinctions. The first is that Fidonet didn't use the familiar word-based addresses we are used to today. No URLs and no DNS servers. This means that you could contact another member only by calling his modem. There were no search engines back then. So how did you find the nearest Fidonet node? Surprisingly, it was simple. A special text file known as the node list circulated throughout the network, listing every node and its phone number in one convenient place. In it were recorded all the nodes with the indication of their owners' phone numbers and additional information. For example, in what hours the node works to receive mail. The second major difference was that almost all network operations were done manually, reminiscent of a 19th century telephone exchange. For example, each mail message was manually directed from point to node, that is, from bottom to top, and then from node to another node if necessary, and then from the node to the final point, from top to bottom. And each such transmission is a call to a specific subscriber, which obviously does not add speed. And while we are on the topic of mail, let's understand what kind of functionality the network had. What could you do on the Fidonet? Not as much as you could do on the internet now, but still. Fidonet rested on 3 main pillars, and each one shaped how people used the network. First was the Netmail. This was basically your classic email, letting you shoot messages from one node or point to another. The second was Echomail. Think of it like a giant forum or message board, where folks could post and discuss all sorts of topics. If you wanted to chat about the latest software, local news, or even your favorite series, Echomail was the place to be. And the last was file exchanges. Despite those slow dial-up speeds, users still swapped programs, docs, and other digital goodies. Sure, it took forever by today today's standards, but back then it felt like a high-tech miracle. And there are several interesting details here. First, Fido Netmail offered almost zero privacy. Each node was required to block any advertising or commercial content, so the operator of that node could and even had to read the message before forwarding it to another node. In addition, even if there was no prohibited information in the message, the node could simply refuse to forward it, and the Fidonet rules would allow it. Secondly, because of the complex system of hierarchy of information transmission, letters could go for days, weeks, and even months to the addressee. And yes, receiving mail was not automatic either. For this, you had to run a special program to call a node, or go to a familiar sys operator with a floppy disk. But the truth is that it was not the most interesting thing that happened in Fidonet. In fact, the whole life was happening in so-called BBS, or Bulletin board system. In BBS, people read news, echoes, and exchanged files, sometimes pirated files. Each sysop had his own BBS, or just a board, and he filled it according to his interests and also defined the rules of working with it. But the most curious thing is how it looked like. Naturally, there was no browser for Fido. Everything happened exclusively through the terminal. And you might think that it was a solid monochrome text, like in the Matrix. But it wasn't. It turns out that thanks to the use of color pseudographics on boards, you could see unique designs. Different colors, even pictures created from pseudographics. Such a design was drawn by a hand and was not only a business card, but also an object of self-expression of the creators. Another interesting question: how did the BBS exchange files? And here the key problem is not only the speed, which was extremely slow, 33 kbit per second, if you were lucky, but also the stability of connection. And if your mom picked up the phone in the middle of that big download.
Hello?
Hey, Cindy, it's Jill.
Hey!
Connection lost. You have to start again. That's why guys mainly transmitted small programs, pictures, books, or some documentation. People got around this with error-correcting formats, like SQ or UU encoding, basically turning a file into text, so if your phone line glitched, you didn't lose the entire thing. For example, this is what a picture converted to SQ looks like. Once a dude on the network tried to transfer a 3 MB MP3 file to SQ. Such a load paralyzed the entire network and led to a big scandal and excommunication of this dude. As you can see, once upon a time, the single song was enough to make a DDoS attack. And now this whole huge network, with its charter of hierarchy and huge geography, became the brainchild of just one programmer. How did that happen? And it turns out Tom Jennings was a man with a special way of looking at the world. Tom Jennings was a real punk with anarchist views, which manifested itself not only in his desire to create a channel of communication outside of government censorship, but also in the teaching activities that he conducted in parallel. For example, he taught students how to break into a car, get out of the trunk, or start a car without a key. In his opinion, it's supposed to stimulate the children's interest in technology. And when Tom launched the Fidonet, he did not think that the network would become so popular that it would be used on the other side of Atlantic Ocean. But as the network grew, its creator became increasingly disappointed. In 1993, Tom Jennings left Fidonet. He essentially created his own protostate with its own bureaucrats. There were many reasons for this, from politicization of the network to the desire of nodes at different levels to regulate everything they want and can regulate. Somehow it just happened that with the founder's exit, the Fidonet began to die out. Well, bureaucratization is probably not the main reason for the Fidonet's failure. Technology is probably the main reason. Fidonet was replaced by the internet, which was much simpler for the average user. You don't have to worry about looking for the address of the node you need. It is more understandable. There are real graphics on the internet, not some symbols. The internet is more stable due to the automation of almost all processes. It is also less centralized and more free. There are no general rules. The internet is better than Fidonet in literally everything. In addition, the speed of internet access was constantly growing, and the cost was falling. There was no point in waiting for a free phone line and the right hour to call a system operator and pick up your mail. However, it was Fidonet that became a very important milestone in the development of world communications. It was this network that gave us what we love the internet for: communication with all kinds of people all over the world, on forums, chat rooms, by email, or in YouTube comments.